The assumptions are normally found after the scope of the study. This is usually near the latter third of your proposal or in chapter 1 of that chapter. You usually find the assumptions will come after the scope, although in some dissertations it may be before the scope, or there may not even be a scope of the study in some dissertations. The difference from one university to the other could be a point of confusion if you're looking at dissertations and trying to figure out how to best create yours. The reason I'm sharing the assumptions here and where it goes after the scope is because this is where I have my mentees use it and where to put it to be able to develop the content flow the best. Again, if your university doesn't require the assumption section or doesn't even have a scope, then that's understandable. In some universities, I've seen where they actually prefer the assumptions with the limitations and delimitations section not to be in Chapter 1, but to be found later in Chapter 3. The assumptions offers the researcher's perspective. This will be your perspective on, of all the assumptions you could mention, which do you believe are the most pertinent to what your research study is about and how it will be conducted. As I go through a couple examples, this will be more easily understood, but it's dependent upon how each person looks at the study and determines what assumptions must be made to collect data that's going to be valid and reliable so that information can be derived from that data that can be used by others to make decisions. If we don't understand the assumptions, we may actually collect data or have data that we don't know how to interpret correctly. The assumptions suggest a reality of research. And in that, I'll give you an example right here, that if you are going to do a qualitative study and you're only going to interview 20 people, one of the realities is that when you interview 20 people until what's known as theoretical saturation, is that that may not represent everybody's point of view. There is an assumption that if you hit theoretical saturation, that you do not need to carry on and do any more interviews because you have started to get to the point where there's no new emerging themes. That's fully acceptable, but the assumption is that when you stop at theoretical saturation, that there are no more new themes that can emerge. It's a possibility some could if you did more interviews, but we make the assumption that at theoretical saturation we can stop. There's also a reality of people. Much like when we're going to do interviews to gain lived experiences, there's an assumption that people will tell the truth, that people will give their honest input, and that if they're mad at their bosses or not feeling good, that they won't give an unsatisfactory representation or one that's false or even a lie. We assume people will do the best. We assume people will help us wherever possible, but we have to realize that some people will lie. Same as in a survey that goes out in a Likert type survey form where there's maybe 5 detractors to pick from when we're asking about a correlation or causation. Somebody may just go right down the middle and do number 3 from number 1 question all the way to the final question because they don't want to do your survey and they just don't have time. Or they may just do A, B, C, D, E detractors, one after the other throughout the whole survey, meaning that they didn't really give their truthful input. That's an assumption we make when we do research, that people will be honest in what they do for us. Assumptions, continuing here, the researchers have to assume things that may not be true, meaning that people may lie. We assume people will tell the truth, but that may not be true. We assume that by doing a fair share sample of 1,500 employees, that by doing that fair share sample, we're assuming that we may get all the information that's needed, but we also have to understand that it may not necessarily be true, because if we don't survey everybody, we can't prove anything. We can only suggest certain information. So the assumptions that we are providing, the researchers have to assume things that may not be true, but we articulate them, and this is common in every research study. There has to be several assumptions that we have to base our work upon. Otherwise, we couldn't continue on and do our work. For example, as I mentioned, assume the sample will represent the whole. If you're only going to interview 20 nurses in a hospital, we have to assume that once we hit that theoretical saturation, that it will represent the whole. That's the reality of doing research, is there are policies, if you will, or guidance that helps us understand that we don't have to survey everybody or interview everybody to be able to get a basic understanding to find out what's going on. The assumptions are often based on a belief, the belief of the researcher. And you doing your study, if I was to do the exact same study, I may have different assumptions. That's okay. And that's why it's subjective. Now, some of them are common, and it's no doubt that we could all say not everybody's going to tell us the truth in an interview. Some people are just going to want to get out of the interview. Some people are going to want to make somebody look bad in an interview. But often the assumptions are based on a belief that people will be truthful in what they do, though we have to understand that perhaps it may not. And these are usually out of the researcher's control. You cannot ensure that everybody you interview is going to tell you the truth. You cannot assume that everybody who does a survey, when you send it out to 1,500 people, are going to be truthful and take the time that you wish they would to be able to fill in the survey accurately. We can assume that it's not always going to be possible for us to ensure that if we have 100 questions, that everybody will do their due diligence for every question to make sure it's answered correctly. But this is okay. This is a reality of research. And it's not to say that you have to try and fix it, or that you have to look over everybody's shoulder when they're doing their survey, or give somebody a lie detector test when you're interviewing them. That would not be possible, of course. But what we understand that these things can potentially impact the data that we're collecting. Therefore, we may actually have information that's not valid. One of the assumptions is that you will be able to analyze your data correctly to provide the right information. We assume that if you're going to use a statistical processing type of software to run your data, that it's going to provide accurate information. But we have the assumption on that, but we can't always be positive unless we have people check and double check, and that's not part of a doctoral dissertation. Assume people will do what is expected. So as we assume that if we're going to interview people, we assume people are going to be truthful. We don't assume they're going to lie, but it's always a potential that they could lie or not give their fair truth. But we're going to assume that people will do the best to help us, and that's what we want to write about. In one sense, we can assume that people will be truthful, but another assumption is that if they're busy or they're not feeling good, that they won't give that truthful answer. So we can look at the assumptions from a positive as well as a perhaps not so positive way. What I want to do is share a couple examples from a few of my students who have graduated at their universities and are now doctors, and they are allowing me to use their information to help you in what we call brain tithing. Every example I've given is from a published dissertation. Most of my mentees were approved on the first pass at the proposal or dissertation because they spent a lot of time developing their work, just like you're doing, investing time to be able to understand better how to develop your proposal and dissertation. Each of my mentees provide me consent to use their work. They own the copyright. I'm just using it here as what I call that brain tithing to share their insights and information with you, as we hope that you will do once you graduate, as you go on to help others as well. So the first example I want to share with you is from Dr. Joseph Hegy. His dissertation is titled Influence of Religion and Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, a quantitative correlation study. Now, Dr. Joe Hegy won the Dissertation of the Year award at the University of Phoenix in the year 2013 for the best quantitative dissertation that was published that year. And in his work, the first assumption he wrote about is here for you to see now, and it says the first assumption was that participants in the study would be honest and objective in discussing topics such as religion and religiosity in the context of the work environment. So as you can see, what he's been able to tell you is that he has the first assumption that the people would be honest and objective. That's what we hope. We hope that people would be honest and objective. And he goes on in that paragraph to say, to facilitate this, the survey respondents were assured in writing of confidentiality and anonymity of their feedback to reduce any potential for hesitation or dishonesty in responses to survey questions. So you can see he made aware for the reader what the first assumption is, that people would be honest, and he helps the reader to understand that he worked with the survey population to help them better understand that everything they did was confidential. Nobody would know what they were going to actually put into the information that became the data. So what the Joseph Hegy is presenting here for us is that opportunity to see the assumption and then how he helped perhaps ensure that people would be more honest. A second assumption that he alludes to is that the number of organizational leaders computed based on a ratio of 1 leader in 5 workers, or 20% of the total workforce in Lebanon. If this calculation was wrong because perhaps that number or that ratio is not true, then that could mean that the data is skewed, that perhaps there were too many or too few that were considered organizational leaders, and therefore that could impact the results of this study. This is something he really can't ensure, but he did do the work to ensure that it would be the ratio provided here for 20% of the workforce that were considered leaders. Now I just jumped to the fifth assumption. The fifth assumption was that participants would comprehend the survey questions and the concepts discussed in them, meaning that in the survey, which was a Likert type survey that people had to read and then fill in the blank for what level or what degree that they believed there was a correlation, he's saying here that there's an assumption that participants could comprehend this survey. Now I have experience with this because when I created my first survey for a client that later became the Supervisor Leadership and Communication Inventory, which goes along with my book, Laws of Communication, I had a few questions in there that had American slang. And so therefore, the first time I used it in a client that had people reading it who did not have English as their first language, did not fully understand all the questions. So this is very important to understand, particularly if you're creating your own survey or if you're taking your survey to another population like Dr. Hegy did, because he took a survey that was more so designed in English and used in America, particularly as it was founded, and used it in Lebanon, where the majority of the people there who took the survey, English was their second language or perhaps even their third language, not their first language. So this assumption is very astute to have in that type of situation. So now you've seen 3 examples of assumptions, and I'll share with you one from Dr. Susan Kristiniak in her dissertation, which is titled Exploring the Experiences of Complementary Therapy Nurses, a Qualitative Phenomenological Study. Here she goes in her first assumption. The first assumption included interpretation of the data that suggests knowledge of semantics of the discipline and experiences within the focus of this research. The recognition of language, understanding of words, and meanings are important aspects in the research process. And then she gives a citation. She goes on to close the paragraph. The assumption is that data analysis required a working knowledge of a particular language of the research topic. What she's indicating here is the assumption that for her, person doing the research, that she has this knowledge or the semantics of the discipline that's taken on in that context. And the assumption is that the data analysis required a working knowledge, that she had that working knowledge. If she didn't have the working knowledge, you could see how, therefore, if somebody said something, she could interpret incorrectly. Again, thank you very much. Have a great evening.